The first thing people noticed was that she never asked for help. Not when Robert died, not when the ground was too frozen to dig a proper grave, and the men from Judith Basin had to wait 3 days before they could put him in the earth. Not when she walked back to the cabin alone, two children trailing behind her, the youngest one still too young to understand what the stillness meant. Eleanor Voss did not ask for help then, and she did not ask for help in May of 1883 when the snow finally pulled back from the ridge and she walked out behind the claim with a rope, a flat-bottom sled she had rebuilt from scrap pine, and a purpose that nobody in Judith Basin could quite explain. She was 34 years old. Her hands were already the hands of a woman who had spent years doing the work that men usually did. The knuckles were thick. The palms were calloused in the places that mattered. She wore her dark hair pulled back without ceremony, and she moved across the land with the kind of quiet efficiency that comes not from confidence, but from the simple understanding that the work will not do itself. She walked to the eastern ridge that morning, and she began pulling stones. Not pebbles, not gravel, stones. Sandstone slabs from the crest of the hill, some of them wider than her shoulders. River rock hauled up from the creek bed in the rope sled 2 and 3 at a time, the rope cutting into her palms through her gloves. Chunks of limestone she had spotted 2 winters ago near the ruins of an old buffalo corral, the wood long since rotted away, the stone still sitting patient and permanent where the animals had left it. She stacked them near a flat piece of ground at the foot of the hill. She said nothing to anyone about what she intended to do with them. By the middle of May, the pile was chest high. Arthur Crane saw it first. Crane ran the largest cattle operation within 10 miles of Judith Basin, a man of around 50 with a broad face that had been weathered into something resembling a topographical map of the territory itself. He rode past on a Thursday afternoon and pulled his horse up short when he saw the pile of stone and the woman standing beside it wiping her hands on her work trousers. He leaned down from the saddle and looked at the pile for a long moment. "Building a fence, Mrs. Voss." "Something like that," she said. He looked at the pile again. Then he looked at her. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh and rode on toward his property to the south. That evening at Alderman's General Store in the settlement, he told 3 men what he had seen. By the following Sunday, most of Judith Basin knew that the Voss widow was piling rocks behind her claim for reasons that nobody could satisfactorily explain. The speculation ranged from practical to charitable to quietly unkind. People in small frontier settlements tend to notice when someone does something differently from the way it has always been done. They notice and they talk, and the talking has a particular texture when the person doing the different thing is a woman living alone. Eleanor was aware of all of this and cared about none of it. She had learned a long time ago that people talk about what they do not understand, and that the most effective response to that kind of talk is to keep working. She kept working. To understand why Eleanor Voss spent 5 months of her life moving stone, you have to understand the 2 winters that came before. You have to understand what it means to lie awake in the dark of a Montana January, with the temperature outside dropping past 30 below, listening to the wind find every crack in a log cabin wall, every gap in the chinking, every place where the green pine had dried and pulled away from its neighbor, and left a seam that the cold could slide through like a blade. You have to understand what it means to get up every 2 hours through the night to feed a fire that eats wood, the way the territory eats men, constantly, indifferently, without any acknowledgement of the effort involved. You have to understand what it means to wake your children in the morning and see their breath hanging in the air inside the house, to see the small red patches on their fingers where the cold had gotten to them in the night, despite everything you did to prevent it. Eleanor had lived through 2 winters like that since Robert died. The first winter she had survived on willpower and desperation. The second winter she had survived on something harder and colder than either of those, on the specific focused determination of a woman who has decided that she is done being at the mercy of something she might be able to fix. Robert Voss had been a capable man. He had built the cabin himself in the spring of 1878, the year they came out from Colorado. Pine logs, standard Montana construction, chinking of mud and river moss, a single stone fireplace on the east wall, a plank floor over packed earth. It was the kind of cabin that hundreds of men had built across the territory. And it worked the way those cabins worked adequately in autumn, poorly in deep winter, and at the cost of enormous quantities of firewood that had to be cut and hauled and stacked before the snows came. Robert had been proud of it. He had every right to be. It was solid work built with his hands, and it had kept his family alive through 4 winters before the river took him. But Eleanor had grown up in the southern part of Colorado, the daughter of a Cornish stonemason named George Aldred, and she had grown up watching her father build things that worked differently from the way wooden things worked. Her father had built root cellars that stayed cool all summer without ice. He had built stone rooms attached to farmhouses that never froze in winter and never needed more than a small fire to keep a family warm. He had talked about stone the way some men talk about livestock or weather, with a kind of intimate, practical knowledge that came from long familiarity. She remembered him saying when she was perhaps 10 years old that wood and stone are different in a fundamental sense. Wood wants to move. It expands and contracts with every change in temperature, every shift in moisture. It breathes, which is what the people who prefer it always say, as if breathing is always a virtue. But a wall that breathes is a wall that leaks, and a wall that leaks lets in the cold. Stone does not breathe. Stone does not move. Stone takes the heat you give it and holds it slowly, deeply, the way a cast iron pan holds heat long after you pull it from the fire. You have to be patient with stone. You have to give it time to warm. But once it is warm, it gives that warmth back to you for hours steadily, without drama, without requiring you to feed it every 2 hours through the night. Eleanor had thought about these things through both of those long winters. She had thought about them while feeding the fire at 2 in the morning and at 4 in the morning. She had thought about them while watching the heat rise to the ceiling and disappear through the gaps in the logs. She had thought about them until the idea stopped being an idea and became something more like a decision. In the spring of 1882, the first spring after Robert died, she had raised the idea carefully with a few of the men she trusted in the settlement. The response had not been encouraging. She remembered particularly the afternoon she had mentioned it to Calhoun Briggs, the settlement's most experienced carpenter, a man of around 45 with a reputation for doing things correctly and knowing it. Briggs had listened to her description of what she intended with the particular expression of a man who is being patient with someone who does not understand the subject under discussion. He told her that stone was cold. Everyone knew that. Touch a stone wall in January, he said, and tell him how warm it feels. He told her that stone held moisture, that moisture meant mold, that a mold-ridden wall in a frontier cabin meant sickness, and sickness on a claim with no man, and 2 small children was something she could not afford. He told her that logs breathed, that breathing was important in a structure people lived in, and that there were reasons why every cabin from here to the Dakotas was built from timber. He was not unkind about it. He was in the way of a man who is very certain he is right, almost gentle. Eleanor thanked him for his time and walked home. But there was a conversation she had not told Briggs about. There was a conversation she had not told anyone about because it was the kind of thing that sits in a private place and does not benefit from being shared. 2 years earlier, in the winter of 1881, a few weeks before Robert died, she had told her husband what she was thinking. She had explained it carefully the same way she had explained it to Briggs. The stone, the heat retention, the thickness of the walls, what she remembered from her father's work in Colorado. Robert had listened. He had been a fair man generally, a man who tried to hear his wife out on most things. But when she finished, he had shaken his head. He said it in front of the Crane family who had come over that evening for a meal. He said it in the way that men sometimes say things in front of other people when they want the other people to understand where the authority in a household resides. "Stone is for the dead," Robert said. "Graves and root cellars. My family needs wood and light." Arthur Crane had nodded. His wife had changed the subject with the diplomatic efficiency of a woman who has learned when to move a conversation along. The matter had been closed. Eleanor had not raised it again. She had filed it away in the part of herself where she kept the things that were not yet finished. When she began pulling stones in May of 1883, she was not primarily thinking about proving Robert wrong. She understood herself well enough to know that the thought was there somewhere in the background of everything she did. But what drove her forward each morning was not the memory of Robert's words in front of the Cranes. What drove her forward was the memory of her children's hands, the red patches on their fingers in the mornings, the small visible evidence of a problem she had the knowledge to fix. She was thinking about not waking up every 2 hours anymore. She was thinking about what it would mean to sleep through the night. The construction began in earnest in late May, once she had accumulated enough stone to start laying a foundation. Eleanor had a plumb bob that had belonged to her father, a simple thing, a small lead weight on a length of fine cord worn smooth from years of use. It had come west with her from Colorado, packed carefully in a cloth bag at the bottom of a trunk, and it was one of the few objects from her childhood that had survived intact. She used it every day. She used it the way her father had taught her to use it, checking each course of stone against the vertical before she moved to the next. The structure she planned was small, 16 feet by 20 feet smaller than the existing cabin by a third, but every dimension had been considered. Every choice had a reason behind it. The walls would be 2 feet thick at the base, narrowing slightly as they rose. Thick not for strength, but for mass, the principle her father had explained more times than she could remember, standing beside the stone walls he built in Colorado, pressing his palm flat against them to illustrate the point. Mass was what held heat. Mass was the whole purpose. The north wall would be dug into the hillside set 3 feet below the surface of the slope, the hill itself becoming insulation on that side. The other 3 walls would stand above ground but banked with sod on the exterior. The structure would not fight the earth. It would lean into it, draw from it, make the earth itself part of the design. The roof would be low, barely 7 feet at the peak, built from overlapping logs and covered with clay and sod. Low ceilings meant the heated air had nowhere to run. The firebox would be built against the west wall, constructed from dense river stone that would not crack under sustained heat. The chimney would be short, just enough to draw the smoke out without dragging the warmth out with it. There would be 2 small windows south-facing covered with greased canvas. The door would be thick pine fitted tight into a stone frame with no gaps for wind to find. She worked through June in the long northern light, laying the first courses of the foundation, packing clay and sand mortar into the joints, checking her lines against the plumb bob. Her children, Clara, who was 9, and James, who had just turned 6, helped where they could. Clara learned to mix the mortar. James learned to pass the smaller stones. In the evenings, Eleanor read to them by lamplight, and they slept in the old cabin, and in the mornings they all went back to the stone. The neighbors watched. Some of them watched with curiosity, some with concern, a few with the particular amusement that attaches itself to projects that seem doomed. By July, when the walls had risen above waist height, and it was clear that this was not a fence or a foundation for something else, but an actual structure meant to be lived in, the commentary at Alderman's store became more specific. "She's building herself a cave," one man said. "Stone pulls cold right into it," said another. "Touch a stone wall in January, you'll understand fast enough." "She'll be back in the log cabin before Christmas," said a third. "Mark it down." Arthur Crane, who heard most of this, said less than the others. But what he said with the particular ease of a man who owns more land than his neighbors and has decided this entitles him to a clearer view of how things work. "It's a root cellar with pretensions," he said one afternoon, and the men around him laughed, and the description spread through the settlement, the way descriptions do when they have just the right combination of wit and plausible accuracy. Calhoun Briggs came back in July. He came not to mock, but to examine, which was in some ways more difficult to manage. He walked around the half-finished structure with the careful attention of a man who knows construction and is applying that knowledge honestly. He looked at the thickness of the walls. He looked at the mortar joints. He looked at the way the north wall stepped back into the hillside. Then he looked at Eleanor. He said the stone would hold moisture. He said it with the same certainty he had expressed the year before, but with slightly less ease because the walls in front of him were better than he had expected. The joints were tight, the courses were level. The north foundation was seated into the slope with a precision that he recognized as competent work, even if he disagreed with the fundamental premise behind it. He told her that when the log wall sweated, the moisture moved through the wood and dried out in the next warm spell. Stone did not work that way. Stone would trap water against itself. In a sealed structure with cooking and breathing and the ordinary moisture of a family living inside it, the interior of a stone wall could become a place where things grew that should not grow. Eleanor listened to all of it. She thanked him. She told him she had thought carefully about ventilation and the mortar composition. He nodded and left. She went back to work. What she did not tell Briggs, what she did not tell anyone, was that in the second week of August, the east wall cracked. She had been laying the third course on that side when she felt it before she saw it, a slight wrong settling in the stones beneath her hands, a subtle shift that should not have been there. She stepped back and looked and saw the hairline fracture running from the second course to the fourth, the kind of crack that happens when the base angle is slightly off and the weight above it finds the weakness. It was not catastrophic. The wall was still standing. But Eleanor knew from everything her father had told her, and from the simple logic of what she was building, that a wall with a crack in the wrong place was not a wall she could trust through a Montana winter. If she left it, and the structure settled further, that crack would widen. And a wide crack in a 2-foot stone wall was not something you could fill with moss and optimism. She sat down on the ground beside the wall. She was alone. The children were at Mrs. Holt's for the day helping with something in the schoolroom. The ridge was quiet around her. The late afternoon light came at an angle across the stone pile and made long shadows. She sat there for a long time. She was thinking about Robert. Not the Robert of the last years, the capable and sometimes difficult man she had shared a claim with, but the Robert of the early years, the one who had carried her trunk from the wagon in Colorado and made her laugh in the kitchen of her father's house. She was thinking about how much she had wanted him to agree with her about the stone, how much it would have meant to build this thing together rather than alone with his hands alongside hers and his voice saying yes instead of no. She was thinking about whether she was right, not about the principle. She was certain about the principle, but about this specific wall, this specific crack, this specific moment in the middle of a project that had consumed her entire summer and that the entire settlement expected to fail. Then she reached into the pocket of her work coat and found the plumb bob. She held it in her palm. The lead weight was small and dark and worn smooth. Her father's hands had worn it smooth over decades of work in Colorado, and before that in Cornwall, checking walls that still stood long after he was gone. She could hear his voice more clearly than she could hear most things from that far back. He had said it to her when she was young, watching him take down a section of wall he had spent 3 days building because he had found a flaw in the foundation course. He had not seemed distressed by the work he was about to lose. He had seemed settled, resolved. He said that stone does not forgive haste, that you cannot rush stone the way you can sometimes rush wood, that stone requires you to be right or to be willing to be right the second time. Eleanor stood up. She began dismantling the east wall the next morning. It took her 3 days to take it down to the foundation course. It took her another 3 weeks to rebuild it, checking every stone against the plumb bob before she mortared it in place, working more slowly than she had worked on any other section of the structure. When it was done, there was no crack. Nobody knew she had done it. The rebuilt wall looked like the rest of the walls. There was nothing visible from the outside that indicated the 3 weeks of additional work that had gone into that particular section. The 3 weeks of quiet, private determination that had taken place while the rest of Judith Basin went about its summer business and occasionally glanced over at the strange stone structure going up behind the Voss claim. By September, the house was finished. Eleanor stood at the doorway on the morning she declared it done, not to anyone else, just to herself. A private declaration made without ceremony, and looked at what she had built. It was not beautiful in the way that some things are beautiful. It sat low against the hillside, dark and compact, the sod roof blending into the slope above it, so that from a distance the structure seemed to be growing out of the earth rather than sitting on top of it. The walls were rough and thick. The windows were small. The door was heavy and plain. It looked, if you were being honest about it, like something that had always been there. Like something the hill had decided to push up through the surface over a long period of time. Inside was different. Inside, the air was already different. She had run a small fire the previous evening just to test the draw, just to begin the slow process of warming the mass of the walls. The fire had been modest and had burned for only a few hours. But when she stepped inside now in the cool September morning, she felt the difference immediately. Not dramatic warmth, not the pressing, urgent warmth of a room with a fire going. Something quieter than that. An evenness. A settled quality in the air, as if the room had made a decision about its temperature and intended to maintain it. She walked the perimeter of the interior and pressed her palm flat against each wall. West wall, where the firebox was warm from the previous evening's fire, still giving back what it had been given. South wall, between the 2 canvas-covered windows, cool but not cold, holding the mild September air without comment. East wall, the wall she had rebuilt solid. Not a suggestion of wrongness anywhere in it. North wall, buried in the hill, the temperature of the deep earth itself. Not cold in the way of an exposed surface. Stable. Constant. The earth at depth holds a temperature that does not vary much from season to season, and that temperature, conducted through the stone that was pressed against it, was present now in this wall, like a slow, patient fact. She stood in the center of the room for a moment. Then she went and got her children, and they moved their things from the old cabin load by load across the September grass. The first snow of the season came that evening. A light snow, early season, the kind that would melt by noon the next day. But it came after dark while they were inside, and Eleanor watched it through the small south window, the flakes catching the lamplight, falling soft and indifferent past the thick stone wall. James fell asleep on his cot without argument. Clara read for a while by the lamp and then also slept. Eleanor sat by the firebox with a cup of water and listened to the silence inside the walls and the quiet of the snow outside. There was no draft, no sound of wind finding a gap, no creaking of logs contracting in the cold. The house sat on its hillside and received the first snow of the season the way it would receive everything that came after it, without alarm, without effort, with the deep indifference of mass and stone. She let the fire burn down to coals and went to bed. In the morning, the room was still warm. Not the fragile warmth of a space that has been heated within the last hour. Not the warmth of a fire burning nearby. The warmth of walls that had taken the heat from the previous evening's fire and held it through the night and were returning it now slowly and steadily, the way her father had always described. She dressed without hurrying. She made breakfast without hurrying. She did not think about the coming winter or about what people in the settlement were saying, or about the expression on Arthur Crane's face when he called it a root cellar with pretensions. She thought about the temperature of the room, which was exactly what it had been when she went to sleep. She thought about her father's hands and the plumb bob worn smooth by them, and the knowledge that he had carried out of Cornwall and across an ocean and set down in Colorado, and that she had carried further west still to this hillside in Montana, where it had waited patient as stone to be put to use. Outside, the September snow had already melted. The ridge was bright in the morning light. The winter was coming, and Eleanor Voss was ready for it. The cold came the way it always comes to Montana, not gradually, not with warning, but as a decision. One morning in early November, the air changed. Not the temperature, not yet, but the quality of it. It became a different kind of air. Thinner, more deliberate. The kind of air that does not pretend to be anything other than what it is, which is the leading edge of something serious. Eleanor noticed it the way people notice things they have been watching for. She was carrying water from the creek when she felt the shift, and she stood for a moment with the buckets in her hands and looked north toward the mountains, where the sky had taken on a particular shade of pewter that she had learned to read over the years. Not gray, not the ordinary gray of a cloudy November sky. Something darker and more purposeful than that. The sky of a season that has made up its mind. She set the buckets down and looked at her woodpile. She had 60 sections of cut timber stacked under the lean-to shed on the east side of the stone house. 60 sections, each one roughly 18 inches long, split and seasoned since August. It was less than half of what her neighbors were carrying into winter. Arthur Crane's operation had 2 men working through October doing nothing but cutting and stacking. She had heard that his main woodpile ran nearly the full length of his barn wall. Calhoun Briggs had stacked well over 100 sections under his workshop roof, maybe more. Even the smaller homesteads in the settlement were putting up 120, 150 sections against the cold. When people asked Eleanor about her wood supply, and a few had with the specific concern of neighbors who have decided to be worried on your behalf, she told them she had what she needed. The responses said everything about what they believed. A polite smile, a slight hesitation before the conversation moved on. The particular expression of people who have offered what advice they can offer and are now prepared to let events make their point for them. Eleanor was not troubled by this. She had been looked at that way before. The first snow of November came on the 2nd of the month and melted by afternoon. A harder snow came 4 days later and stayed on the ground. The creek froze from the banks inward slowly, the ice advancing a few inches each night, until by the 12th of November it was solid across, and Eleanor had to break it each morning to get water. The air became what she could only describe as deliberate, not simply cold, but committed, as if the cold had decided it was done with preliminaries and wanted to proceed to the main event. She brought the children inside earlier each evening. She checked the door frame, the window coverings, the fit of every joint where something might let wind through. She found nothing loose. The stone house sat on its hillside with the quiet assurance of a thing that does not require checking. On the evening of November 18th, Owen Farley knocked on her door. Farley was a trapper somewhere around 55, a man of very few words and considerable experience in Montana's winters. He ran his line north of Judith Basin, up into country, where few people went voluntarily after October, and he came through the settlement 2 or 3 times each season, selling pelts and buying supplies, and saying almost nothing to anyone beyond what was required for those transactions. Eleanor had spoken to him perhaps a dozen times over the years. She respected him the way you respect a person who has survived many difficult winters without drama or complaint and who has no interest in talking about it. He stood at her door in the darkness with his pack on his back and snow on his shoulders and asked if she had room for a man to sleep near a fire. She let him in. He stood in the center of the room for a moment after she closed the door. He looked at the walls. He looked at the ceiling, low and close, the roof logs visible above him. He looked at the firebox, which held a fire that was not large, a steady, moderate burn that had been going for a couple of hours, the kind of fire that is enough but not emphatic about it. "Stonehouse," he said. "Yes," she said. He considered the room again. "Cold in winter," he said. Not a question. An observation about what he understood to be true. "Warmer than you'd expect," Eleanor said. He made a non-committal sound, set his pack down near the west wall, and accepted the food she offered. He ate without much conversation, which suited her. The children were already in the loft. The fire settled quietly in the firebox. Before he slept, Farley looked around the room one more time. His eyes moved across the walls with the assessing quality of a man who spends a great deal of time evaluating shelter. "Unusual choice," he said finally. "It works," she said. He considered this without visible reaction, lay down with his pack under his head, and was asleep within minutes. In the morning, Eleanor woke before first light and started the breakfast fire. Farley was already on his feet, pack-shouldered, standing at the door. He paused before opening it. "North wind coming," he said. "Bad one. I'd say 2 days out, maybe less." "I know," she said. He nodded once, opened the door, and walked out into the pre-dawn dark. She watched him move north through the gray light, a shape growing smaller against the pale snow, until the terrain absorbed him. She closed the door. She had no way of knowing, standing there with the breakfast fire building behind her, that Owen Farley was the only person who would see the interior of that house before the storm arrived. She had no way of knowing that this quiet, self-sufficient man, who had called her choice unusual and then walked away into the dark without another word, would become 4 days later the person who told the rest of Judith Basin what he had witnessed. None of that was visible yet. All that was visible was the gray morning and the cold and the mountains to the north carrying their particular darkness. The blizzard came on the 19th of November. It did not build gradually from something lighter. It arrived. 1 hour the sky was the heavy pewter of a loaded November morning. The next the world had contracted to a white radius of perhaps 30 yards in every direction, beyond which there was nothing, no ridge line, no tree line, no sense of where the ground ended and the sky began. The wind came with it. Not the ordinary Montana wind that you lean into and walk through, but something that moved with genuine conviction, finding the weakness in every structure it touched, and pressing that weakness without pause or mercy. Eleanor heard it hit the stone house and felt almost nothing. That was the thing she would remember afterward. She stood in the center of the room with the wind hitting the walls at a volume she could feel in her chest, and the walls around her simply absorbed it. No shuddering, no sense of the structure negotiating with the storm. The stone had been here before this storm and would be here after it. The storm was a temporary condition, and the walls understood that if walls can be said to understand anything. She added 2 sections of wood to the firebox, adjusted the draw slightly, and sat down at the table. She had a clear view of the south windows from where she sat, 2 small squares of greased canvas that had gone white with the driven snow. The light coming through them was flat and directionless, the kind of light that makes it hard to tell the hour. By mid-morning it was already the color of late afternoon. By noon it was nearly dark. Eleanor lit the lamp and set it on the table. Clara came down from the loft and helped with the midday meal. James came down after still half asleep, his dark hair pushed up on one side from the pillow. They ate together at the table, the lamp between them, the wind working outside and inside. The only sounds were the fire and the ordinary sounds of a family eating together. "Is it bad out?" James asked. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Are we all right?" "Yes," she said again. He accepted this and went back to his food. He was 6 years old, and he trusted her completely, which was both the simplest and the most serious fact of her life. 3 miles to the south in Judith Basin proper, the first day of the blizzard was testing every structure that anyone had built. Arthur Crane had a well-constructed operation. He was not a careless man. His main cabin was solidly built from seasoned timber. The chinking had been renewed in October, and he had gone into the storm confident in his wood supply. By nightfall of the first day, he had revised that confidence downward considerably. The wind was finding gaps he had not known existed. He could feel them drafts at floor-level cold air pushing along the bottom of the north wall, where the chinking had compressed in ways he had not caught during his inspection. The fireplace was working at full capacity, and the heat it produced rose toward the ceiling and toward the chimney, and the corners of the room stayed cold despite everything. His wife Martha moved the family's sleeping area toward the hearth. By midnight of the first night, Crane was feeding the fire every 45 minutes. He was consuming wood at nearly twice the rate he had planned. In his workshop on the far side of the settlement, Calhoun Briggs was faring somewhat better. His construction was superior thicker logs, better fitted chinking a stone hearth he had built himself over 3 careful weeks the previous summer. The first night of the blizzard, his family was uncomfortable but not in danger. By the morning of the second day, the temperature had dropped further, the kind of drop that is not about degrees so much as about character, a cold that arrives with a different quality than what came before, heavier and more settled. Briggs's cabin fought it the way good construction fights serious cold, which is to say adequately and no more than that. The far corners of the main room, the corners farthest from the hearth, where his 4-year-old daughter Winifred slept on the small cot he had built for her, began to lose the argument with the cold in a way that Briggs could observe but could not reverse. He moved the cot closer to the fire. He added blankets. He looked at the corners of the ceiling where condensation had begun to freeze into a thin white rime and understood that his cabin, for all its quality, was not winning this particular contest. He kept the fire as high as he dared. In the settlement itself, the communal logic of frontier life was asserting itself in the way it does during serious weather. People began moving toward the larger structures. Mrs. Edna Holt, the schoolteacher, had a small cabin that had always served her well enough for ordinary winters. By the afternoon of the first day, she understood that ordinary was a word that no longer applied. The cold moved through her walls with a persistence that frightened her. She banked her fire, wrapped her most important belongings, and walked through the storm to a neighbor with a larger hearth. By the end of the second day, Alderman's general store had a dozen people in it. By the third morning, 15, they kept fires going at 3 points in the building. They rationed wood without discussing it openly, each person calculating what was left and how long it needed to last. They were not in danger of dying precisely, but the awareness of what might happen if the wood ran out was present in the room like an additional occupant, taking up space, making the air feel used. 3 miles to the north, Eleanor Voss added 2 sections of wood to her fire on the morning of the second day and watched her children eat breakfast. The temperature outside, had she been able to measure, it was near 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Inside the stone house, the air was what it had been the day before even, and settled a temperature the walls had chosen and were sustaining without difficulty. The fire she had built that morning was not a large fire. It did not need to be. The walls had been warming for days now, and they were returning that warmth steadily, the way mass returns, heat slowly, consistently, without peaks and without failures. The fire was almost secondary. The walls were doing most of the work. She was washing the breakfast dishes when she saw him. She almost missed it. The driven snow moved past the south window in a continuous white roar, and visibility beyond the glass was essentially nothing. She looked through the canvas-covered window from habit more than expectation, the way you look at a window during a storm, not because you expect to see anything useful, but because the impulse to look is stronger than the knowledge that looking is pointless. The shape was not moving when she first registered it. A dark mass in the white roughly 200 yards from the house, and for a moment she read it as a piece of fence post or a section of lumber the wind had brought down. Then the shape moved, not the way debris moves in wind, but with the unmistakable, terrible quality of a person who is using the last of what they have just to stay upright. Then the shape went down. Eleanor stood at the window. She understood what she was seeing. A person. A small person, slight and young, who had come north from the settlement on foot in a blizzard at 40 below, for reasons she could not begin to imagine, and who had fallen in the snow 200 yards from her door and was not getting up. She had perhaps 5 seconds of complete clarity. Not hesitation clarity, the kind of clarity that comes when a situation has reduced itself to its essential structure and you can see it whole. If she went out, she left Clara and James alone in a blizzard. Clara was 9, capable and sensible, but 9. If she did not go out, the person in the snow was going to die there, 200 yards from a warm house, on a morning when she had enough wood to last another 2 days without difficulty. She turned from the window. "Clara," she said. Her voice came out level, which was what she needed it to do. "Come here." Clara was at the table. She stood immediately and came to her mother, reading her face with the accuracy that children develop when they have learned to pay close attention to the one person responsible for their survival. Eleanor told her what she had seen. She told her what she was going to do. She told Clara to bar the door after her and not to open it for any reason until she heard her mother's voice. "How long?" Clara asked. "I don't know," Eleanor said. "Not long, bar the door." She took her heaviest coat from the hook. Scarf, gloves, boots. She opened the door and the cold came through the opening like something physical, like a presence, and she walked out into it and pulled the door shut behind her and heard the bar drop on the inside. The wind hit her immediately. She had to angle into it to move at all. The snow was past her ankles within 3 steps, and the cold was not cold in any way. She had language for it was a different category of sensation, something that bypassed the usual vocabulary of discomfort and went straight to a more basic register. She had oriented herself to the dark shape before she left the house. She kept that bearing in her mind and moved toward it, counting her steps, because in this visibility there was nothing else to navigate by. At 160 steps, she almost walked past him. He was face down, half buried already by the drift that was forming against his back. She dropped to her knees beside him and got her hands under his shoulders and turned him over, and she saw it was Fletcher Crane, 12 years old, Arthur Crane's son. A boy she had known since he was small, who had apparently decided on some errand or impulse she would never fully understand to walk 3 miles north through a blizzard. He was conscious. Barely. His eyes were open and tracking her with the slow, confused movement of a person whose core temperature has dropped far enough that thinking has become difficult. His coat was not adequate for conditions like these, she could see that immediately. His hands were the wrong color. She got him upright. She got his arm over her shoulder and took as much of his weight as she could manage. She turned back toward the house, which she could not see, and began walking in the direction she had come from, counting backward in her head, trying to hold the line. The wind pushed against her with the mindless persistence of physics, indifferent to what she was carrying or why. She put one foot in front of the other and kept counting and did not think about how far it was or whether she was holding the right direction. She thought about the count. She thought about keeping Fletcher's feet moving alongside hers. At some point, Clara's voice came through the white calling from ahead of her, and Eleanor steered toward it. The door was there. She got Fletcher through it. She got him to the floor near the firebox. Clara was already kneeling beside her with blankets moving with the focused competence of a 9-year-old who knows what needs doing. Eleanor closed the door. She stripped Fletcher's outer layers and wrapped him. She checked his hands. 2 fingers on his right hand were white and waxy, the classic presentation of frostbite that has not yet gone past the point of recovery. She warmed them the way she knew frostbitten tissue needed to be warmed, gradually, using the warmth of her own hands first, and then water that she heated on the fire, not hot, not fast, just warm and patient and sustained. It took 2 hours. During those 2 hours, the fire needed a section of wood, and she fed it one-handed without getting up, keeping her other hand cupped around Fletcher's. James, who had come down from the loft, sat across the room and watched with the wide-eyed quiet of a 6-year-old who understands that something serious is happening and that the right response is to stay out of the way. When Fletcher finally opened his eyes fully, the unfocused confusion clearing gradually into something more like ordinary awareness, he looked at the ceiling of the stone house. Then he looked at Eleanor kneeling beside him. "You're safe," she said. "You're in the warm." He turned his head and looked at the stone walls. He looked at the firebox where the fire was moderate and unhurried. He looked at the stack of wood beside it, which was still largely intact. Then he did something that Eleanor would think about later in the days after the storm, when the significance of small actions became clearer in retrospect. He lifted his free hand, the one Eleanor wasn't holding, and reached sideways and pressed his palm flat against the stone floor beside him. He held it there for a moment. Then he moved his hand to the lower section of the nearby wall. He pressed it against the stone. He did not say anything, but something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, more like a recalibration. The slow rewriting of an assumption he had held without knowing he held it. He lay back and stared at the ceiling, and Eleanor could see him thinking, working through something, putting what he was feeling under his palm against what he had always believed about stone and cold. He did not speak for a long time after that, but the quality of his silence had changed. He was not the silence of someone barely conscious. He was the silence of someone paying close attention. The 3rd day of the blizzard was the worst. The temperature dropped further still into a range that eliminated any ambiguity about what kind of storm this was. The wind did not ease. If anything, it found new consistency, a sustained assault that had none of the variation of ordinary storms, no brief lulls, no shifts in direction that gave you a moment to think. In the settlement, the wood at the general store was running critically short. People were breaking up furniture. Someone had pulled boards from an interior partition. The 15 people in that crowded space had moved through discomfort and into the specific quiet fear that arrives when you do the arithmetic on what remains and it does not come out right. Arthur Crane in his cabin was in a similar position. He had burned through his carefully stacked supply at a rate that his pre-storm calculations had not anticipated. His fireplace was doing what it had always done, drawing well-producing heat, and that heat was going where heat always went, in a log cabin which was up and out, concentrated near the ceiling and the chimney, and thin near the floor where his children sat. He was breaking apart a storage bench when he allowed himself for the first time to think about the stone house 3 miles north. He pushed the thought away. He had more wood to find. Calhoun Briggs woke before dawn on the third morning with the particular instinct that wakes parents when something is wrong. He found Winifred's foot. The cot was still near the fire. He had moved it 2 days ago, but the child had shifted in the night, and one small foot had worked its way free of the blankets and extended toward the edge of the cot, toward the part of the room that was cooler. 2 toes on her right foot were stiff and pale and cold to the touch. He treated it himself in the dark while the rest of his family slept, warming the foot slowly the way you had to, not rushing it. He sat beside his daughter for the better part of an hour, with her small foot held between his hands, watching the color come back by lamplight. It came back. The toes warmed. She did not wake. When he was certain she was all right, Briggs set her foot carefully back under the blankets and sat in the dark for a long time without moving. He was looking at the walls of his cabin. His well-built, carefully constructed cabin, the best cabin in Judith Basin by the general consensus of people who knew construction and thinking about a stone house 3 miles north on a hillside, and a woman who had built it herself over 5 months while the settlement watched and waited for her to fail. He was thinking about what she had said when he warned her about moisture and breathability. She had listened. She had thanked him. She had not argued, and she had kept building. He sat with that for a long time in the dark. 3 miles north, Eleanor slept. She slept with the uncomplicated ease of a person who has done what needed to be done and trusts what she built to continue doing its work. She had added wood at 10 in the evening and again at midnight, a combined total of 2 sections, and then she had slept until nearly 5 in the morning. The room was warm when she woke, not the pressed, maintained warmth of a space fighting to hold its temperature. The easy, continuous warmth of a room that had been warm all night because the walls had decided it would be so. Fletcher was asleep near the firebox, wrapped in blankets, his breathing regular, the color back in his face. Eleanor checked his hand in the lamplight. The 2 fingers were pink and slightly tender-looking, which was correct, which was what recovery looked like. She covered him again and left him to sleep. She put a section of wood on the fire. One section, she made coffee. She sat at the table in the lamplight with her cup and listened to the storm outside and the silence inside and the particular quality of that contrast. The violence beyond the walls and the stillness within them had a quality she could not quite put into words. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was something more straightforward than either of those. It was the satisfaction of a thing working the way it was supposed to work, which is one of the quieter and more lasting forms of satisfaction available to a person. The walls were warm, the fire was small, the woodpile was still more than half intact. Outside, the storm had said most of what it had to say. On the morning of November 23rd, it finished saying it. The morning of November 23rd arrived without ceremony. No gradual lightening of the sky, no slow retreat of the wind from violence to calm. The blizzard simply stopped the way a conversation stops when the person speaking has said everything they came to say and has nothing left to add. 1 hour, the world beyond the south windows was white and roaring. The next, it was still. Eleanor heard the silence before she registered the change in the light. She was sitting at the table with her second cup of coffee, Fletcher Crane still asleep near the firebox, her children not yet down from the loft, when she became aware that the sound she had been living inside for 4 days was simply gone. The absence of it had a physical quality the way the absence of a sustained noise always does, pressing against the ears, noticeable not because of what it was, but because of what it had replaced. She set her cup down. She stood and walked to the door and opened it. The cold came in immediately, clean and absolute, the kind of cold that exists after a blizzard, the way silence exists after thunder. Total. Clarifying. The sky above the ridge was a blue so specific and deep, it looked like something intentional, like a color chosen rather than arrived at by weather. The snow lay across the landscape in long, smooth geometries, covering the familiar terrain into something new. The angles of drifts and the curves of buried structures creating a world that had not existed 5 days ago. Eleanor stood in the doorway and looked at her woodpile. The lean-to on the east side of the house had held through the storm. The wood stack beneath it was dry. She looked at what remained and made the count without moving closer. The stacks were orderly enough that the number was visible from where she stood. Roughly 40 sections remained. She had burned fewer than 20 sections across 4 days of the worst blizzard she had experienced since coming to Montana. Her stone house with its modest firebox and its 2-foot walls and its low sod roof and its north face buried in the hillside had kept her family alive and warm and comfortable on fewer than 5 sections of wood per day. She stood there and let that fact exist for a moment, plain and without elaboration. Then she went inside and started breakfast. Fletcher Crane woke when he smelled the food. He was a 12-year-old boy, and the habits of 12-year-old boys do not suspend themselves on account of dramatic circumstances. He sat up from his blankets, looked at the ceiling, looked at the walls, looked at the south window, where the blue of a clear sky was now coming through the greased canvas, a blue so different from the white that had filled that window for 4 days, that it seemed almost to belong to a different world. He ate 2 full plates of breakfast without saying much. Eleanor did not press him. There are things that people need time with before they have language for them. And what Fletcher had been through, the walk through the blizzard, the fall in the snow, the slow return to warmth in a room made of stone that was not supposed to be warm, was the kind of experience that takes longer than a night to fully arrive at. After he finished eating, he looked at his right hand and flexed the 2 fingers that had been frostbitten. Tender still, but working. He looked at Eleanor directly with the straightforwardness that 12-year-olds sometimes have when they have decided to say something and are going to say it regardless of how it lands. "You came out in the storm," he said, "to get me." "You needed getting," she said. He absorbed this. "Then my father is going to want to know what happened." "Your father is going to want to see you home first," Eleanor said. "That's the thing to take care of." She walked him back toward the Crane property herself, the two of them moving through the brilliant, brutal cold of the post-blizzard morning, the snow compacted and squeaking under their boots, the sky enormous and blue above the white landscape. She walked with him until she could see the smoke from the Crane cabin's chimney and knew he could make the rest of the distance without difficulty. She turned back north. She did not know, walking back to her house in the cold, clear morning, exactly what was coming. She was not a woman who spent much time anticipating things. She had learned that the most reliable form of patience is the kind that does not try to predict what it is waiting for. She did not have to wait long. Owen Farley arrived before noon. He came from the north, which meant he had been in the worst of the storm's territory for 4 days. He had found shelter in a rock formation he knew from previous trapping seasons, a natural depression in the terrain that he had used before in bad weather, and had waited the storm out with the kind of patience that is not a personality trait, but a survival skill acquired over years of working in country that punishes impatience with consequences that are difficult to recover from. He looked the way a man looks after 4 days in those conditions. Weathered past what weathered usually means. His movements were deliberate in the way that sustained cold makes movement deliberate, careful, precise, nothing wasted. He had come south toward the settlement and had remembered somewhere on the trail the widow with the stone house 3 miles north of Judith Basin. He had thought about her situation. He had thought about it the way a man who has spent decades in Montana winters thinks about such things practically without sentiment, arriving at a conclusion about what he was likely to find when he arrived. He had not expected to find her alive and comfortable. Eleanor saw him coming from the south window and opened the door before he reached it. He stopped when the door opened. He stood for a moment in the cold air outside and looked at her standing in the doorway, present and composed, not damaged, not desperate, not wearing the expression of someone who has come through something by the thinnest of margins. He looked past her into the interior of the house. The fire in the firebox was a moderate, unhurried burn. The air that came past Eleanor into the cold outside was warm, not the urgent warmth of a space fighting to recover a temperature it has lost, but the settled, continuous warmth of a space that had simply been warm all along. Farley stepped inside. He walked directly to the west wall and pressed his open palm flat against the stone near the firebox. Warm as he expected the stone adjacent to the heat source. He crossed to the south wall. He pressed his palm against it. Warm. Less than the west wall, but warm. He stood for a moment, then walked to the far corner of the room. The northeast corner, the farthest point from the firebox. The corner nearest the door. The corner that in any structure he had ever sheltered in would be the coldest point. The point where frost formed on interior surfaces during serious cold. He stopped in front of that corner and pressed his palm against the stone. He held it there for a long moment. The wall was warm, not the warmth of direct heat. The warmth of mass that has been holding temperature for days and is not done holding it. Even here in the corner, farthest from the fire in the corner nearest the exterior, the stone was warmer than the air outside by a margin that meant something. The margin that meant you would not freeze here. The margin that meant you would sleep through the night. Farley turned from the corner. He looked at the wood pile beside the firebox. He looked through the open door at the stacks under the lean-to. He made a count in his head. "How much did you burn?" he asked. "Fewer than 20 sections," Eleanor said. "For all 4 days." He stood very still. He was a man who had spent decades navigating Montana winters. He understood wood consumption the way navigators understand tides, not theoretically but in the body. In the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of nights, when the difference between enough heat and not enough heat was not an academic question. He knew what 4 days in a blizzard of that severity cost in firewood in a standard cabin. He had seen those numbers in other people's homes and felt them in his own shelter. He knew what 20 sections meant against what those 4 days had demanded. He picked up his pack without a word. "I'll be at the settlement tonight," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. He paused at the door. He looked at the walls one more time, not the assessing look of a man still forming a judgment, but the look of a man who has finished forming it and is recording the conclusion. "You built it right," he said. Not a compliment exactly. An observation delivered with the precision that characterized everything Farley said. From him it carried the weight of something considerably more than praise. He walked out into the blue cold and headed south. That evening in Alderman's General Store, where most of the settlement had gathered to account for losses and share what resources remained, and do the hard arithmetic that follows serious weather. Owen Farley told them what he had seen. He said it the way he said everything plainly without elaboration, describing what he had observed and nothing beyond it. He described the walls and the temperature. He described the northeast corner that should, by every reasonable expectation, have been the coldest point in the room and was warm. He described fewer than 20 sections burned against 4 days of the worst blizzard in the basin's recent history. The room was quiet when he finished. Then someone said it didn't sound right. Then someone else said stone couldn't work that way. Everyone knew stone was cold. That was the nature of stone. A third voice suggested the widow had probably burned more wood than she was saying, or had remembered the count wrong, or had some other source of heat that Farley hadn't been shown. Farley listened to all of this. He had said what he had seen. He was not a man who felt any particular obligation to argue with people who had decided in advance what was possible. He poured himself a measure of whiskey from a bottle someone had opened and stood by the wall and waited, because in his experience, people who have access to the evidence eventually get around to looking at it. What moved the room was not Farley's testimony. It was Fletcher Crane. He was standing near the back beside his father Arthur, who had survived the storm with his cabin intact and his furniture reduced and his woodpile nearly gone, and some portion of his certainty about how things worked quietly revised. Fletcher had been largely silent since his return to the settlement that morning. The silence of a person carrying something that has not yet found the right moment. He stepped forward from beside his father. He spoke without self-consciousness, without the performance anxiety that sometimes takes hold of 12-year-olds when they speak in front of adult audiences. He had been inside the stone house. He had been inside the walls. He could describe what the temperature felt like, what the woodpile looked like, what the air felt like in the morning. When he woke up, the same temperature at the floor as at the ceiling. Warm in the corners, warm near the door. The fire, not a large fire. The kind of fire you might build in October. Not the fire of a person fighting for warmth, but the fire of a person maintaining something that is already under control. He described lying on the floor near the firebox and pressing his hand against the stone and finding it warm. Not fireplace warm. not the warmth of a surface directly heated. Something deeper than that, something that lived in the stone itself. Then he told them about the walk through the storm and the fall in the snow and what had happened after. He told them that Mrs. Voss had come out into the blizzard to bring him in, that he had been down in the snow 200 yards from her door, and she had walked out through 40 below wind and driven snow to find him and get him back inside. He said it without drama. He said it the way you state a fact that you believe is relevant to the matter being discussed. The room was completely quiet. Arthur Crane had not moved during his son's account. He was a physically substantial man, the kind who occupies a room without effort, and he had stood motionless through all of it, through the description of the walls and the wood count and the temperature of the corners, through the account of the rescue, through the silence that followed. He had stared at the floor for most of it, and now he looked up. His face had a quality that was not his usual face. Something had shifted in it. Something that had been easy and settled before the storm was no longer easy or settled. "I want to see it," he said. "Tomorrow morning. I want to go up there myself." Nobody suggested this was unnecessary. Nobody offered an alternative. Arthur Crane was the kind of man that people did not redirect as a general practice. And in this specific moment, there was something in his voice that made even the general practice feel beside the point. They came the next morning, not as an organized group, not with any stated common purpose. They came the way people come to things they are not yet entirely sure they believe in, ones and twos separately, with incidental reasons prepared for why they happened to be heading north that particular morning. Arthur Crane came first and alone, and he came without a prepared reason. He stood in Eleanor's main room, and he did not perform the examination that Farley had performed wall by wall, corner by corner. He stood in the center of the room for a moment, feeling the air around him, and then he walked to the northeast corner and put his hand against the stone. He stood with his hand on the wall for a long time, longer than necessary to form a judgment. Long enough that Eleanor, watching from near the firebox, understood that he was not simply assessing the temperature. He was doing something else, working through something that did not have a simple resolution. When he turned around, his expression had the particular quality of a man who has been wrong about something significant and is in the early stages of understanding the full dimensions of that wrongness. He did not say anything about root cellars. He did not say anything at all for a moment. Then he said, "Fletcher told me you came out into the storm." "He needed help," Eleanor said. Crane looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked at the walls. Then he said he had some questions about the construction if she was willing to answer them. She told him she was. They sat at the table and she answered his questions about wall thickness and firebox placement and the sod roof and the way the north face was set into the slope, and he listened with the focused attention of a man who has decided he is learning something rather than evaluating something, which is a different quality of listening. He thanked her when he left. He said it simply, which meant more than if he had elaborated. Everett Marsh came the following day. Marsh was a methodical man in his early 40s who had come to the territory from St. Louis and who had brought with him certain habits of mind that distinguished him from many of his neighbors, a preference for measurement over impression, a respect for numbers as a more reliable guide to reality than general consensus. He had a thermometer that he used to monitor the temperature in his root cellar, a practice that most of the settlement considered eccentric and that Marsh considered simply sensible. He asked Eleanor if he could take readings inside her house. She told him to help himself. He came back every day for a week. Morning, midday, and evening, he recorded the temperature inside the stone house and compared it against the temperature outside. He recorded both sets of numbers in a small notebook with the careful handwriting of a man who understands that records are only useful if they are legible. Outside, across that week in early December, the temperature ranged between 10 degrees below zero and 5 degrees above the ordinary cold of a Montana December, not the exceptional cold of the blizzard, but serious enough to be meaningful as a test. Inside Eleanor's stone house, Marsh's thermometer read between 65 and 71 degrees Fahrenheit across every reading at every hour of every day he measured, a variance of 6 degrees over an entire week. He had never recorded a variance that small in any structure he had monitored. He went back to his own cabin, a well-built structure of nearly identical interior dimensions, and counted the wood he had burned in the same 7-day period. More than 40 sections. He had a cold patch along the north wall at floor level that on the coldest morning his thermometer placed at 42 degrees. He brought his notebook to Eleanor without comment and set it on the table in front of her. She looked at the columns of numbers, The outside temperatures and the inside temperatures day after day, the inside column barely moving, while the outside column swung between its highs and lows. "You can keep taking readings if you want," she said. "I intend to," he said, "through the winter." He did, and the numbers continued to say the same thing week after week in the patient language of measurement that does not care what anyone believes. Calhoun Briggs came on the fourth day after the storm. He did not come casually. He came in the morning with the deliberate bearing of a man who has made a decision about something difficult and is going to follow through on it properly. He had his work coat on. He had the particular expression of a man who is preparing to do something that costs him something. Eleanor let him in and gave him room. He spent a long time in the house. He examined the mortar joints with his fingertips, pressing into them, testing for softness or moisture. He looked at the ceiling where the roof logs met the wall plate. He checked the corners carefully, not for temperature, but for the moisture and mold growth that he had warned Eleanor about a year and a half earlier. He pressed his thumbnail into the clay mortar between the stones in 3 different locations. Cured hard, dry, clean. No softness anywhere, no sign of the moisture retention he had predicted with such certainty. He went to the firebox and examined the construction of the surround, the angle of the back wall, the opening dimensions, the throat. He looked at it for a while without comment. Then he went to the northeast corner. He stood there with both hands flat against the stone, one at shoulder height and one near the floor, feeling the temperature at both levels. He stood there for longer than Farley had stood there, longer than Crane. He was not just measuring, he was reckoning. When he turned around, Eleanor was standing by the firebox. She had 2 cups of coffee. She held one out. He took it. He stood with the cup in both hands and looked at the floor for a long moment. When he looked up, his face had the expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he is not going to soften or qualify. "The second night of the blizzard," he said. "Winifred, my youngest, she's 4. Eleanor waited. "I had her cot near the fire. I'd moved it 2 days before I knew the far corner was losing heat. But she shifted in the night and her foot came out from the blankets." He stopped, looked at the cup in his hands. 2 toes, frostbite. I caught it before first light. I treated it myself. She was all right, she is all right. Nobody knew." The fire in the firebox settled. "If I had built differently," he said, "if I had looked at what you were trying to do instead of explaining to you why it was wrong, Winifred's cot would have been in a different room. A room with walls like these." He shook his head once, a short, precise movement. "She's completely all right. But that hour in the dark, waiting for the color to come back, I'll carry that." Eleanor looked at him. "She's all right," Eleanor said. "That's the thing that matters." He looked at her with an expression she recognized, the expression of a person being offered more grace than they came expecting and not quite knowing what to do with the difference. "I was wrong," he said. "I told you with considerable confidence that you were making a mistake, and I was wrong. The moisture, the breathability, He stopped himself. "I was wrong." Eleanor did not tell him that it was fine, because it had not been entirely fine. His certainty had been one of the things she had carried through the summer, one of the voices she had needed to continue building in the face of. But she also did not elaborate on this because there was nothing useful in the elaboration now. She said, "The wall on the east side, I had to pull it down and rebuild it in August. Took 3 weeks. I used my father's plumb bob on every stone." Briggs looked at the east wall. "It doesn't show," he said. "No," she said. "That's the point." He looked at the wall for a moment longer. Then he drank his coffee and Eleanor drank hers, and they stood in the warmth of the stone house, while the December cold did what it always did outside, and the house did what it was built to do. After a while, Briggs set down his cup. "I have questions," he said, "about the construction, the firebox in particular, the stone selection, the backing angle. If you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. They talked for an hour. Briggs listened with the specific leaning-in quality of a man who has stopped knowing and started learning, which is a different posture entirely, and one that suited him better than he would have predicted. By January, the conversation in Judith Basin had changed. Not dramatically, not with the enthusiasm of a community that has witnessed a revelation and is rushing to embrace it. These were frontier people, and frontier people do not rush toward anything, including good ideas. They observe, they calculate, they wait to see whether the thing being considered works past the first test, and the second test, and the third, and whether the person advocating for it is still standing behind it when the easy part of advocacy is long since over. But they were observing Eleanor's stone house with a different quality of attention now. The attention of people who have updated what they believe and are looking at the evidence through that updated understanding. Arthur Crane began planning in January. He had the resources and the decision-making efficiency that his position required. He was building a stone barracks for the men who worked his cattle operation, the men who currently slept in a long timber bunkhouse that ate firewood at a rate Crane now understood was not necessary. He came to Eleanor twice with specific questions about wall construction and firebox placement and roof design. He asked without any of the manner he had brought to his earlier visits. He asked as a man who has accepted that the person he is asking knows something he needs to know. On his second visit, Eleanor showed him the plumb bob. He took it from her and turned it over in his broad hand, a small worn lead weight on a length of cord, the kind of thing you could walk past 100 times without registering. "Your father's," he said. "He was a stonemason. Cornwall before he came to Colorado." Crane nodded slowly, looking at the small weight. "This kind of building, it's old knowledge." "Very old," Eleanor said. "Older than this territory. Older than this country." He turned the plumb bob over once more, then placed it carefully back in her palm. "We forgot it," he said. It was not quite a question. "Some of us did," Eleanor said. He left without saying anything more, but she could see him thinking as he went working through something larger than firebox placement or wall thickness, working through what it meant that the knowledge had been there all along, carried by certain people, accessible if anyone had thought to ask. Everett Marsh finished his winter of temperature readings and drew up plans for what he called a winter room, a stone addition to the east side of his cabin built on Eleanor's principles, with thick walls and a low ceiling and a south-facing window and a firebox built from riverstone. He showed her the drawings. She pointed out 2 places where the wall thickness was insufficient and 1 place where the firebox placement would create a draft problem. He revised the drawings and built accordingly the following spring. Mrs. Edna Holt came in January, walking north through the ordinary cold of a clear winter morning with the particular purposefulness of a woman who has made up her mind about something. She asked to see the house. Eleanor showed her. Holt walked the perimeter of the interior the way Crane had, looking at the walls and the ceiling and the windows. She stopped at the south wall between the 2 small canvas-covered windows and stood looking at it for a moment. "I thought it looked unfinished," she said. "When you were building it, I thought it looked like something that hadn't decided what it was yet." She turned and looked at Eleanor. "I was wrong about that." "Most people were," Eleanor said. "Everett Marsh called it a fortress," Holt said. "I think that's the right word for it. Not because it looks like one, because it functions like one." She paused. "It kept you safe." "It kept us warm," Eleanor said. Safety followed from that. Holt considered this distinction. "Yes," she said finally, "that's exactly right." By the spring of 1884, 7 new stone structures had appeared in and around Judith Basin. Not copies of Eleanor's house, each one was different, adapted to the specific site and materials and needs of the family that built it. Arthur Crane's stone barracks was longer and lower than Eleanor's house, designed for a different purpose. Everett Marsh's winter room was an addition rather than a standalone structure. 2 families had built hybrid constructions, stone on the north and west faces, where the cold came hardest timber on the south and east. 3 were working structures, the barracks a storage house, a workshop where the principles of thermal mass mattered more than the particular aesthetics of the result. None of them looked exactly like Eleanor's house, but all of them shared the things that could not be varied without losing the point. Thick walls, low roofs, south-facing openings. The north side set into or banked against the earth wherever the terrain permitted. Fireboxes built from dense stone chosen for heat retention rather than convenience. The specific forms changed with every builder and every site. The underlying principle remained the same, passed from Eleanor's house outward to the houses around it, the way useful knowledge passes not through proclamation or instruction, but through the evidence of results that anyone could see. Eleanor did not position herself as a teacher. She answered questions when they were asked. She showed her construction to anyone who came to look. She did not organize meetings or write up her methods or seek any formal acknowledgement of what she had contributed. She kept her wood supply stacked, and her fire burning, and her children fed, and her mortar joints maintained, and she let the house make whatever argument needed to be made. In the summer of 1884, a package arrived from Colorado. She had written to her uncle, her father's younger brother, the last of that generation still living in the southern part of the state the previous spring, asking whether any of her father's papers had survived. His working papers specifically. His notes from his stonemason years. The package came in June, wrapped carefully in oilcloth and addressed in her uncle's hand. Inside was a small notebook. It was her father's handwriting. George Aldred's working notebook kept across decades of building in Colorado and before that in Cornwall. The pages were dense and careful, not the elegant penmanship of a formal education, but the precise notation of a tradesman who records things accurately because accuracy in his trade matters in ways that are not abstract. There were sketches of wall cross-sections with dimensions noted, observations about different stone types and how they behaved under sustained heat, notes on mortar ratios for different conditions, records of specific projects, specific problems, specific solutions. Interspersed with the practical entries were occasional references to other men builders her father had worked alongside and learned from in Cornwall, whose names meant nothing to Eleanor, but whose observations set down in her father's handwriting were familiar to her because she had applied them herself without knowing whose thinking she was building on. She turned to a page near the middle of the notebook and found a passage that stopped her. Her father had written in his careful tradesman's hand, "The stone does not create warmth. It accepts warmth from the fire and returns it slowly across hours and through the night. This is the complete principle. You are not heating air, you are heating mass. And mass, unlike air, does not surrender what it has been given." She read it twice. Then she sat with the notebook open on the table and looked at the south wall across from her, warm in the June afternoon light coming through the small windows. Her father had articulated in a few lines what she had understood in her body and her hands through the work of building and through the 4 days of the blizzard. She had not been able to say it that cleanly, but the understanding had been the same understanding, the same principle arrived at through her memory of his teachings, and then confirmed by every morning she had woken up in a warm house while the winter did its worst outside. She had not invented anything. She had not discovered anything. She had remembered something that her father had learned from older builders, who had learned it from builders older still. A chain of understanding that ran back through generations of people who had worked with stone and fire and cold, and had arrived through practice and patience at a knowledge that was simple enough to write in a few lines and difficult enough to require a lifetime to fully apply. The frontier had forgotten it. She had not. That was the whole of it. Eleanor closed the notebook with care and placed it in the cloth bag where she kept the plumb bob. The two objects sat together in the bag, the worn lid weighed on its cord, the small notebook with its dense pages. Her father's tools in the most complete sense of that word, the physical instrument and the recorded thought. She put the bag in the chest at the foot of her bed. Outside, the Montana summer was doing what it briefly does, making an extravagant case for itself. The grass on the ridge fully green, the creek running clear, the sky in those latitudes in early summer, enormous and lit with a quality of light that makes you understand why people came to this country in the first place, despite everything it cost them when they arrived. Clara was on the ridge collecting something, plants or stones. She was always collecting one or the other. James was at the creek. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the stone house with the door open to the summer and felt the interior of the house behind her cool, in the way that stone interiors are cool in summer, holding the memory of the cold months in its mass, moderating the season, the way it moderated every season without drama and without effort. The house sat against the hillside exactly as it had sat since the September of the previous year, low and thick, the sod roof settling further into the slope above it, with each passing month the walls unchanged. From a distance it still looked less like something built than something found, a feature of the landscape that had always been there and would continue to be there. Eleanor looked at it for a moment. It had kept her family alive through the worst winter in Judith Basin's recent history. It had done it quietly without drama, consuming less than a third of the firewood her neighbors had burned, and returning warmth steadily and without fail through 4 days when steadiness and reliability were the only things that mattered. It had done exactly what she had understood it would do based on what her father had told her, and what his teachers had told him, and what their teachers had told them, going back through generations, to people who had worked with stone and cold and fire in a country across the ocean, and had learned the same things by the same method of patient attention to results. She turned and went inside and started supper. Her children came in as the light changed. Clara with her pockets full of something, James with mud on his boots, and Eleanor fed them and listened to them and sent them to bed in the loft when the lamp was the only light left. She sat alone at the table for a while after they were asleep. The fire had burned down to coals. The room was warm. The walls held the warmth the way they always held it, steadily, without announcement, as a simple matter of what they were and what she had built them to be. She thought about her father and about the Cornwall builders whose names were in his notebook, and about the long chain of attention and practice and transmission that had arrived through all those hands and all those years at a plumb bob in her pocket and a stone house on a hillside in Montana. Knowledge does not belong to any single person. It lives in the people who remember it, and it goes dark when they forget, and it comes back when someone chooses to remember again. Eleanor had chosen to remember, and the winter had answered. She let the fire go to coals and went to bed. The stone house stands today, not as a home its years as a lived-in place ended generations back, when the families of Judith Basin moved toward larger towns, and the territory became a state, and the frontier became the subject of history, rather than the condition of daily life. The structure itself remains on a hillside north of what is now Lewistown, Montana. Low and compact against the slope, the sod roof replaced several times across the decades, the doorframe renewed. The walls have not changed. They are the walls Eleanor Voss laid in the summer of 1883, stone by stone through June and July and August, and into September, checked against her father's plumb bob, mortared with clay and sand, set into the earth on the north face, and open to the southern light. They have held through 140 Montana winters since the blizzard of November 1883. They have absorbed ice and thaw and the slow violence of expansion and contraction across more than a century, and they have done it without cracking, without failing, without requiring anything from anyone except to be left alone to do what stone does, which is to hold. If you go there on a winter afternoon and the door is not locked, and it is possible to go, you will notice the air inside is different from the air outside. Not dramatically so. Not the difference between cold and a heated room. Something subtler than that. The air of a space that has been holding a particular relationship with temperature for a very long time and intends to continue. If you put your hand against the wall, you will feel it. Not the warmth of a recent fire. There has been no fire in that firebox for many years. The warmth in the stone now is older than any particular fire. It is the accumulated warmth of every winter that has ever come to that hillside and found those walls waiting, the warmth that stone accepts slowly and returns slowly and does not surrender easily. Her father wrote that mass does not surrender what it has been given. The walls of Eleanor Voss's stone house have been standing on that hillside for more than 140 years, and they are standing still, and if you press your palm against them in the cold of a winter afternoon, you will understand what he meant. The frontier laughed at her. The blizzard did not move her, and when the winter finally showed what it was capable of, the stone house answered without hesitation. The way things built correctly always answer simply, completely, and without any need to say a word about it.